Good evening, everyone. Delighted to be here. I've been told this was the last presentation today, so that's always a challenge. So my name is Loic van Cutsem, and indeed I work for Biodiversity. We help companies and cities to monitor and to regenerate biodiversity. And we use for that indeed bees, technology and satellite imagery so that we can, and our own biological and ecological expertise to provide data, insights, information so that people can understand the impacts they're having on the environment, how the environment is impacting them, and we provide them then recommendations for action. Okay? We exist since 10 years and we're active across lots of different sectors in 20 countries. And you can imagine when we started 11 years ago, going to companies and to cities and telling them, well, okay, now you need to monitor your impacts on biodiversity was quite a hard sell. It still is actually today. But at the time they were getting started with carbon and, they told us, it's hard enough with carbon. We don't need to manage nature or biodiversity. And so I would like to try to help you make the case, perhaps within your organization, convince your leadership why it's absolutely strategic to manage biodiversity and nature. Now, I realize there's been a lot of talks already on nature. So just as a small experiment, and I'll ask you to do the same at the end of my pitch, can you just raise your hands if you feel you already have the arguments to convince your organization, your boss, to consider biodiversity as strategically as climate? Just show of hands. I know I've discussed with some of you. Some of you are much more experts than I am, so I know there are some. Great, but not all of you. So I do hope that after my presentation, there'll be a couple more hands. All right. So when we talk about biodiversity or nature, and some of you are familiar probably with this slide, right? We often understand plants, animals, perhaps genes, ecosystems. But what we take for granted often is all the amazing services that biodiversity or nature offers us. Think of, our food, our medicine, clean air, fresh water, carbon sequestration, security against natural disaster, but also the amazing well-being and leisure offers that nature provides. And these are all services, so I would say nature underpins really our society, our economies, and our existence. And we take this for granted. It's been estimated by I think this was by the OECD, that all these services that nature provides for free are actually worth $125 trillion per year. That's 1.5 times GDP. And we still, probably because we've disconnected ourselves a bit from nature over the last 50 years, a lot of us take this for granted, and a lot of businesses take this for granted, although they depend on it. So nature provides a free lunch, but only if we control our appetites. And I would argue that we as humans are not very good at controlling our appetites, and certainly we're not getting better. Now, we know, and you've heard a lot about this already probably today, but we're depleting our natural resources and really putting ourselves, our well-being, our humanity, but also our economy at risk. There are many frightening figures. Some of you are on the slides. You've heard this before probably. We've lost 70% of our species since 1970. That means look at your neighbor left, your neighbor on the right. That means one of you three is still there, the others disappeared, and we happen to be one of those species, by the way. There's over 1 million species at risk of extinction. 60% or more of our soils, relating perhaps slightly to the previous conversation, of our soils in Europe are unhealthy and degraded. So the situation is bad. As a matter of fact, the World Economic Forum listed biodiversity as one of the top economic risks for the coming 10 years. All the other ones in green are, by the way, climate-related risks. So we're in a pretty terrifying situation, as you know. Now, what are the causes of biodiversity decline? There are 5 main causes, as a reminder. The first one, and still the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, is land and sea use change. So we're building much more, Intensive agriculture is, of course, destroying forests, so we're losing a lot of land, which means a lot of habitat and food for species. We're exploiting our resources, overfishing, overhunting, etc. Pollution is the third reason. Air pollution is, by the way, the biggest environmental health risk in Europe. Over 90% of the global population lives in polluted areas, according to the World Health Organization. And we're dumping huge amounts of chemical substances and pesticides every day, which poison animals and species, but also poison us. And as you probably know, almost 50% of the food we eat contains pesticides. And lastly, and that's not often spoken of, but invasive species. So we're more and more introducing non-native species into our environments, and this has a huge cost. Recent study from last week from the IPES, which is kind of the equivalent of GIEC, but for nature, estimates the yearly cost at above 400 billion euros. A client we work with spends over 200 million euros per year to eradicate invasive species. So that's the fifth reason. The fifth reason is obviously climate change. I almost forget it, but I think we know that when we've discussed it. It's of course one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss, but it's a bit, interdependent, of course, because biodiversity is also a great ally to reach climate goals. So yeah, we're not good at controlling our appetite, but we are pretty good at putting our head in the sand and not acknowledging the situation. And certainly in the business sector, many actors are still not understanding that they completely depend on nature, right? So before I move on to I just wanted to make the link again with climate change. So for those of you, and I've been there, I used to work in a previous life as sustainability manager for a large company. This was now 15 years ago, actually. And I remember doing first carbon, trying to sell the carbon agenda to the leadership team. And I came to them with, figures like these, a narrative, which I thought was very convincing. They told me, okay, well, this is nice, but it's not a business priority. So I had to do my homework and come up with a plan in euros of, we're going to save so many 100 million euro of energy. We're going to find business opportunities. That did work. They accepted it. To complete the story, side story, but so it was completely accepted, the whole plan with all the measures, but the CEO after the meeting came to me and said, hey, it's great, but that thing on putting a limit on the CO2 of cars, just make sure it doesn't apply to my car. Now, that was 15 years ago. I hope it has evolved. But just to say, lots of you are probably putting a lot of effort in defining net zero goals or your carbon goals, and that's great. But I'm sorry to say that it's only the beginning, and it's only one dimension of the real issue. And this is a study from last year, I think mostly focused on large companies in the US. While the majority have climate goals, climate targets, only 3% today have biodiversity targets. And we need to bridge this gap. Okay, so this is probably not enough to convince, your boss or your leaders. We need to probably talk a bit more about euros, money, risks, opportunities, and that's what I'm going to do. This figure has been circulated a lot. It was updated a couple months ago by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Over half of our GDP, our global domestic product, is highly or moderately dependent on nature. So over half of our value creation of our economy depends on nature. And of course, the study goes further. If some of you are interested, it's really a nice study. It details the same per sector. Now, it's obvious that some sectors are completely dependent on nature, meaning their business is at risk if ecosystems continue to degrade. Think of agriculture, fishery, construction, and others. But all other industries are somehow affected and dependent on nature as well. So actually, without taking care of nature, we're actually putting our business at risk. And the same relates for investors, and there's more and more awareness among investors that nature should be considered as a priority and offers some risks and some opportunities. The study also quantifies for the different stock exchanges what's the percentage of the companies or the market value of these stock exchanges that depends on nature. For the Deutsche Börse, for example, it's 70% of the companies listed on the Deutsche Börse are heavily, or at least moderately, dependent on nature. So this presents also for investors a risk and an opportunity that they need to look into. And as a matter of fact, they are increasing to look into this. Now, so this all means businesses are facing risks, physical risks, so continuity and resilience of their business, of their supply chain, of their communities. Increasingly regulatory risks. There are now more and more regulations that are in the building. The Global Biodiversity Framework was finally approved in Montreal last year. This is now being translated into national policies. We've heard about it today, the CSRD, so the mandatory sustainability disclosure requirements. There's a lot coming on that will put pressure on companies to consider biodiversity more strategically from that perspective. So regulatory risk, there's a market risk. Consumer patterns are changing. More and more people are aware of these nature risks and are demanding their companies to adapt, and reputational risks. So that's the risk agenda. It's a boring one, but it's one that works with business. And there's one thing that business usually know: the earlier you anticipate risk, the less costly it is in the long run. Now, more exciting is the opportunity agenda. Obviously, we've mentioned it before, but the biodiversity is a key ally to reach our climate goals. As a matter of fact, without protecting and regenerating biodiversity, we will never reach the climate goals, not even to speak about the Paris Agreement, but even other less ambitious goals. So that's one. It can be linked to the existing climate agenda. Access to finance, as mentioned, will be more and more influenced by your capacity to understand and manage your nature impacts. And value creation, right? This is really an opportunity, and there are some great examples emerging to rethink your business models, your products, your services, and to make them more nature positive, right? I mean, circular economy to some extent fits into this. Regenerative agriculture, when it's well done, also goes in this direction, but new types of products, and there are some great startups here using biochar or other ways to produce cement. So there's a huge opportunity to innovate and generate business through this as well. So companies need to act. It's urgent. And what does act mean? Well, first of all, assess their risks and their dependencies and their impacts on nature and the related opportunities. So understand, how does my business interdepend with nature? Which impacts am I having? How do I depend on nature? And how does this translate into risks and opportunities? Start gathering data. And this is going to be a very complex exercise for biodiversity. I'll come back to that in a minute. The earlier companies start collecting data, the better it will be. And set goals, set ambitions, and rethink your business model accordingly. Keeping in mind, and this is true, of course, for the climate agenda, but even more for the biodiversity agenda, which is by definition a more local one, involve your local stakeholders, your local communities, and collaborate. Now, the good news for companies is that there are more and more tools that are emerging, to help them do that. There's some, won't go into details here because it's quite boring, but there are some exciting new developments, frameworks like the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, or the SBTN, Science-Based Targets for Nature, are frameworks that the TNFD is being launched next week, which really define in details how organizations should manage their nature risks and opportunities, how they should and how they should report on this. So this will create a lot of momentum, and there are a lot of tools that are appearing that can help organizations understand their nature risks. I've listed some here in the slide, but I won't go into details there. As opposed to carbon, where 1 ton of carbon emitted in Germany is equivalent, let's say, to a ton of carbon emitted in France or even in Sri Lanka, biodiversity is much more complex, right? First of all, you cannot limit it to one unit. it will require different types of metrics to measure. But second, it's local by definition. The ecosystem or the biodiversity here is not the same as in another country or another ecosystem. So you need to address this locally and to find local data, which is one of the big challenges in this field for the time being. There are different solutions appearing. Some of them are exhibiting here, using satellite imagery, drones, acoustics to analyze the sounds of the different birds or species, for instance, in a specific location, environmental DNA analysis, and we combine those and use bees to do that. Now, how does this work? So as you know, bees, we use bees as natural drones, actually. Bees visit billions of flowers on a rather large surface, 1.5 kilometer radius from the beehive. So they cover 700 hectares and visit billions of flowers. I'm talking about honeybees here. Visit billions of flowers to bring back pollen and nectar, food, to the beehive. So we work with beekeepers all over the world who send us very small samples of the pollen. We analyze this pollen in our labs. Now, why is pollen exciting? Because it contains the DNA of all the plants that were visited by the bees on this large surface. It fixes industrial pollutants and agricultural pollutants. So we can find above 600 pesticides, heavy metals, nitrates. So it's full of information, right? So that's what we do. We analyze the pollen, interpret this data, and provide it back to our clients with metrics and recommendations. And they use this to steer decisions and to monitor the impact of the projects they are taking. So a couple examples maybe, or one example, because I'm out of time actually. A German example is Siemens in Berlin. As some of you may know, that they have this large development project called Siemensstadt, kind of building this huge campus. Won't discuss that in details, but they also foresee to replant and rewild and ensure that what they're doing does not impact biodiversity negatively, but has a positive impact. So we've been monitoring what they're doing in the area now since 2 years, every 3 months, to make sure that what they're doing, what they're planting, their construction work is indeed having a positive impact on plant diversity, and other metrics, and advise them accordingly, for instance, in this case, on what should be planted when we see that there is a specific lack of biodiversity in June, for example. I'll stop there with a quote I heard recently from Dr. Frauke Fischer, which some of you might know. I heard this in a podcast and I find it so powerful. Climate change is about how we live. Biodiversity loss is about whether we live. I'll leave you with this very strong quote, and thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, have a nice evening.